Love and Mr. Lewisham by H. G. Wells. Narrated by Sam Cousy. Chapter 1 introduces Mr. Lewisham. The opening chapter does not concern itself with love. Indeed, that antagonist does not certainly appear until the third, and Mr. Lewisham is seen at his studies. It was 10 years ago, and in those days he was assistant master in the Whartley Proprietary School, Whartley, Sussex, and his wages were £40 a year, out of which he had to afford 15 shillings a week during term time to lodge with Mrs. Munday at the little shop in the West Street. He was called Mr. to distinguish him from the bigger boys, whose duty it was to learn, and it was a matter of stringent regulation that he should be addressed as Sir. He wore ready-made clothes. His black jacket of rigid line was dusted about the front and sleeves with scholastic chalk, and his face was downy and his moustache incipient. He was a passable-looking youngster of 18, fair-haired, indifferently barbered, and with quite an unnecessary pair of glasses on his fairly prominent nose. He wore these to make himself look older, that discipline might be maintained. At the particular moment when this story begins, he was in his bedroom. An attic it was, with lead-framed dormer windows, a slanting ceiling and a bulging wall, covered, as a number of torn places witnessed, with innumerable strata of florid old-fashioned paper. To judge by the room, Mr. Lewisham thought little of love, but much on greatness. Over the head of the bed, for example, where good folks hang text, these truths asserted themselves, written in a clear, bold, youthfully florid hand. Knowledge is power, and what man has done, man can do. Man in the second instance referring to Mr. Lewisham. Never for a moment were these things to be forgotten. Mr. Lewisham could see them afresh every morning as his head came through his shirt, and over the yellow-painted box upon which, for lack of shelves, Mr. Lewisham's library was arranged, was a schemer. Why, he should not have headed it scheme, the editor of the Church Times, who calls his miscellaneous notes Varia, is better able to say than I. In this scheme, 1892 was indicated as the year in which Mr. Lewisham proposed to take his BA degree at the London University with honours in all subjects, and 1895 as the date of his gold medal. Subsequently, there were to be pamphlets in the liberal interest, and such like things duly dated. Who would control others must first control himself, remarked the wall over the wash-hand stand, and behind the door against the Sunday trousers was a portrait of Carlyle. These were no mere threats against the universe. Operations had begun. Jostling Shakespeare, Emerson's essays, and the penny life of Confucius, there were battered and defaced school books, a number of the excellent manuals of the University Correspondence Association, exercise books, ink, red and black, in penny bottles, and an India rubber stamp with Mr. Lewisham's name, a trophy of bluish-green South Kensington certificates for geometrical drawing, astronomy, physiology, physiography, and inorganic chemistry adorned his further wall, and against the Carlyle portrait was a manuscript list of French irregular verbs. Attached by a drawing pin to the roof over the wash-hand stand, which, the room being an attic, sloped almost dangerously, dangled a timetable. Mr. Lewisham was to rise at 5, and that this was no vain boasting, a cheap American alarm clock by the books on the box witnessed. The lumps of mellow chocolate on the papered ledge by the bedhead endorsed that evidence. French until 8, said the timetable curtly. Breakfast was to be eaten in 20 minutes, then 25 minutes of literature to be precise, learning extracts, preferably pompous, from the plays of William Shakespeare, and then to school and duty. The timetable further prescribed Latin composition for the recess and the dinner hour, literature, however, during the meal, and varied its injunctions for the rest of the 24 hours according to the day of the week. Not a moment for Satan and that mischief still of his. Only 70 has the confidence, as well as the time, to be idle. But just think of the admirable quality of such a scheme. Up and busy at 5, with all the world about one horizontal, warm, dreamy-brained or stupidly hullish if roused only to grunt and sigh and roll over again into oblivion. By 8, 3 hours, clear start. 3 hours knowledge ahead of everyone. It takes, I have been told by an eminent scholar, about 1,000 hours of sincere work to learn the language completely. After 3 or 4 languages, much less, which gives you, even at the outset, 1 each a year before breakfast. The gift of tongues picked up like mushrooms. Then that literature, an astonishing conception. In the afternoon, mathematics and the sciences. Could anything be simpler or more magnificent? In 6 years, Mr. Lewisham will have his 5 or 6 languages, a sound all-round education, a habit of tremendous industry, and be still but 24. He will already have honour in his university and ampler means. One realizes that those pamphlets in the liberal interests will be no obscure platitudes. Where Mr. Lewisham will be at 30 stirs the imagination. There will be modifications of the schema, of course, as experience widens. But the spirit of it is a devouring flame. He was sitting facing the diamond-framed window, writing fast, on a second yellow box that was turned on end and empty, and the lid was open, and his knees were conveniently stuck into the cavity. The bed was strewn with books and copygraphed sheets of instructions from his remote correspondence tutors. Pursuant to the dangling timetable, he was, you would have noticed, translating Latin into English. Imperceptibly, the speed of his writing diminished. "You writ to me," he murmured, and his eyes travelled from the book out of window to the vicar's roof opposite and its ivied chimneys. His brows were knit at first and then relaxed. "You writ to me." He had put his pen into his mouth and glanced about for his dictionary. "You rare?" Suddenly his expression changed. Movement dictionary-ward ceased. He was listening to a light tapping sound. It was a football outside. He stood up abruptly and, stretching his neck, peered through his unnecessary glasses and the diamond panes down into the street. Looking acutely downward, he could see a hat daintily trimmed with pinkish white blossom, the shoulder of a jacket, and just the tips of nose and chin. Certainly the stranger who sat under the gallery last Sunday next to Frobisher's. Then, too, he had seen her only obliquely. He watched her until she passed beyond the window frame. He strained to see impossibly round the corner. Then he started, frowned, took his pen from his mouth. "This wandering attention," he said. "The slightest thing. Where was I?" He made a noise with his teeth to express his irritation, sat down and replaced his knees in the upturned box. "You writ me," he said, biting the end of his pen and looking for his dictionary. It was a Wednesday half-holiday late in March, a spring day glorious in amber light, dazzling white clouds, and the intensest blue, casting a powder of wonderful green hither and thither among the trees and rousing all the birds to tumultuous rejoicings. A rousing day, a clamatory, insistent day, a veritable herald of summer. The stir of that anticipation was in the air. The warm earth was parting above the swelling seeds, and all the pine woods were full of the minute crepitation of opening bud scales. And not only was the stir of Mother Nature's awakening in the earth and the air and the trees, but also in Mr. Lewisham's youthful blood, bidding him rouse himself to live in a sense quite other than that the schemer indicated. He saw the dictionary peeping from under a paper, looked up, eurythmy, appreciated the shining nitor of Glycera's shoulders, and so fell idle again to rouse himself abruptly. "I cannot fix my attention," said Mr. Lewisham. He took off his needless glasses, wiped them, and blinked his eyes. This confounded Horace and his stimulating epithets. "A walk?" "I won't be beat," he said, incorrectly, replaced his glasses, brought his elbows down on either side of his box with resonant violence, and clutched the hair over his ears with both hands. In 5 minutes' time he found himself watching the swallows curving through the blue over the vicarage garden. "Did ever man have such a bother with himself as me?" he asked vaguely but vehemently. "It's self-indulgence does it. Sitting down's the beginning of laziness." He stood up to his work and came into permanent view of the village street. If she has gone round the corner by the post office, she will come in sight over the palings above the allotments, suggested the unexplored and undisciplined region of Mr. Lewisham's mind. She did not come into sight. Apparently she had not gone round by the post office after all. It made one wonder where she had gone. Did she go up through the town to the avenue on these occasions? Then abruptly a cloud drove across the sunlight. The glowing street went cold, and Mr. Lewisham's imagination submitted to control. So mater saeva cupidinum, the untamable mother of desires. Horace, Book 2 of the Odes, was the author appointed by the university for Mr. Lewisham's matriculation, was after all translated to its prophetic end. Precisely as the church clock struck 5, Mr. Lewisham, with a punctuality that was indeed almost too prompt for a really earnest student, shut his Horace, took up his Shakespeare, and descended the narrow, curved, uncarpeted staircase that led from his garret to the living room, in which he had his tea with his landlady, Mrs. Munday. That good lady was alone, and after a few civilities, Mr. Lewisham opened his Shakespeare and read from a mark onward. That mark, by the by, was in the middle of a scene, while he consumed mechanically a number of slices of bread and wort jam. Mrs. Munday watched him over her spectacles and thought how bad so much reading must be for the eyes, until the tinkling of her shop bell called her away to a customer. At 25 minutes to 6, he put the book back in the window-sill, dashed a few crumbs from his jacket, assumed a mortarboard cap that was lying on the tea-caddy, and went forth to his evening preparation duty. The West Street was empty and shining golden with the sunset. Its beauty seized upon him, and he forgot to repeat the passage from Henry VIII. That should have occupied him down the street. Instead, he was presently thinking of that insubordinate glance from his window and of little chins and nose-tips. His eyes became remote in their expression. The school door was opened by an obsequious little boy with lines to be examined. Mr. Lewisham felt a curious change of atmosphere on his entry. The door slammed behind him. The hall with its insistent scholastic suggestions, its yellow marbled paper, its long rows of hat pegs, its disreputable array of umbrellas, a broken mortarboard, and a tattered and scattered Principia, seemed dim and dull in contrast with the luminous stir of the early March evening outside. An unusual sense of the greyness of a teacher's life, of the greyness indeed of the life of all studious souls, came and went in his mind. He took the lines, written painfully over 3 pages of exercise book, and obliterated them with a huge GEL scrawled monstrously across each page. He heard the familiar mingled noises of the playground drifting into him through the open schoolroom door. Chapter 2. As the Wind Blows. A flaw in that pentagram of a timetable, that pentagram by which the demons of distraction were to be excluded from Mr. Lewisham's career to greatness, was the absence of a clause forbidding study out of doors. It was the day after the trivial window peeping of the last chapter that this gap in the timetable became apparent. A day, if possible, more gracious and alluring than its predecessor, and at 12:30, instead of returning from the school directly to his lodging, Mr. Lewisham escaped through the omission and made his way, Horace in pocket, to the park gates, and so to the avenue of ancient trees that encircle the broad Wortley domain. He dismissed the suspicion of his motive with perfect success. In the avenue, for the path is but little frequented, one might expect to read undisturbed. The open air, the erect attitude are surely better than sitting in a stuffy, enervating bedroom. The open air is distinctly healthy, hardy, simple. The day was breezy, and there was a perpetual rustling, a going and coming of the budding trees. The network of the beeches was full of golden sunlight, and all the lower branches were shot with horizontal dashes of newborn green. Tu nisi ventis debes ludibrium cave was the appropriate matter of Mr. Lewisham's thoughts, and he was mechanically trying to keep the book open in 3 places at once, at the text, the notes, and the literal translation, while he turned up the vocabulary for ludibrium when his attention, wandering dangerously near the top of the page, fell over the edge and escaped with incredible swiftness down the avenue. A girl wearing a straw hat adorned with white blossom was advancing towards him. Her occupation, too, was literary. Indeed, she was so busy writing that evidently she did not perceive him. Unreasonable emotions descended upon Mr. Lewisham, emotions that are unaccountable on the mere hypothesis of a casual meeting. Something was whispered. It sounded suspiciously like, "It's her." He advanced with his fingers in his book, ready to retreat to its pages if she looked up, and watched her over it. Ludibrium passed out of his universe. She was clearly unaware of his nearness. He thought intent upon her writing, whatever that might be. He wondered what it might be. Her face, foreshortened by her downward regard, seemed infantile. Her fluttering skirt was short and showed her shoes and ankles. He noticed her graceful, easy steps. A figure of health and lightness it was, sunlit, and advancing towards him, something, as he afterwards recalled with a certain astonishment, quite outside the schema. Nearer she came, and nearer, her eyes still downcast. He was full of vague, stupid promptings towards an uncalled-for intercourse. It was curious she did not see him. He began to expect almost painfully the moment when she would look up, though what there was to expect. He thought of what she would see when she discovered him, and wondered where the tassel of his cap might be hanging. It sometimes occluded one eye. It was, of course, quite impossible to put up a hand and investigate. He was near trembling with excitement. His paces, acts which are usually automatic, became uncertain and difficult. One might have thought he had never passed a human being before. Still nearer, 10 yards now, 9, 8. Would she go past without looking up? Then their eyes met. She had hazel eyes, but Mr. Lewisham, being quite an amateur about eyes, could find no words for them. She looked demurely into his face. She seemed to find nothing there. She glanced away from him among the trees and passed, and nothing remained in front of him but an empty avenue, a sunlit, green-shot void. The incident was over. From far away, the soughing of the breeze swept towards him, and in a moment all the twigs about him were quivering and rustling, and boughs creaking with a gust of wind. It seemed to urge him away from her. The faded dead leaves that had once been green and young sprang up, raced one another, leapt, danced and pirouetted, and then something large struck him on the neck, stayed for a startling moment, and drove past him up the avenue. Something vividly white, a sheet of paper, the sheet upon which she had been writing. For what seemed a long time, he did not grasp the situation. He glanced over his shoulder and understood suddenly. His awkwardness vanished. Horace in hand, he gave chase, and in 10 paces had secured the fugitive document. He turned towards her, flushed with triumph, the quarry in his hand. He had, as he picked it up, seen what was written, but the situation dominated him for the instant. He made a stride towards her, and only then understood what he had seen. Lines of a measured length, and capitals. Could it really be? He stopped. He looked again, eyebrows rising. He held it before him, staring now quite frankly. It had been written with a stylographic pen. Thus it ran: "Come, sharp's the word." And then again, "Come, sharp's the word." And then, "Come, sharp's the word. Come, sharp's the word." And so on, all down the page, in a boyish hand, uncommonly like Frobisher II's. "Surely, I say," said Mr. Lewisham, struggling with the new aspect and forgetting all his manners in his surprise. He remembered giving up imposition quite well. Frobisher II had repeated the exhortation just a little too loudly, had brought the thing upon himself. To find her doing this jarred oddly upon certain vague preconceptions he had formed of her. Somehow it seemed as if she had betrayed him. That, of course, was only for the instant. She had come up with him now. "May I have my sheet of paper, please?" she said with a catching of her breath. She was a couple of inches less in height than he. "Do you observe her half-open lips?" said Mother Nature in a noiseless aside to Mr. Lewisham, a thing he afterwards recalled. In her eyes was a touch of apprehension. "I say," he said, with protest still uppermost, "you oughtn't to do this." "Do what?" "This. Impositions for my boys." She raised her eyebrows, then knitted them momentarily, and looked at him. "Are you Mr. Lewisham?" she asked with an affection of entire ignorance and discovery. She knew him perfectly well, which was one reason why she was writing the imposition, but pretending not to know gave her something to say. Mr. Lewisham nodded. "Of all the people, then, frankly, you have just found me out." "I am afraid I have," said Lewisham. "I am afraid I have found you out." They looked at one another for the next move. She decided to plead in extenuation. "Teddy Frobisher is my cousin. I know it's very wrong, but he seemed to have such a lot to do and to be in such trouble. And I had nothing to do. In fact, it was I who offered." She stopped and looked at him. She seemed to consider her remark complete. The meeting of the eyes had an oddly disconcerting quality. He tried to keep to the business of the imposition. "You ought not to have done that," he said, encountering her steadfastly. She looked down and then into his face again. "No," she said, "I suppose I ought not to. I am very sorry." Her looking down and up again produced another unreasonable effect. It seemed to Lewisham that they were discussing something quite other than the topic of their conversation, a persuasion patently absurd and only to be accounted for by the general disorder of his faculties. He made a serious attempt to keep his footing of reproof. I should have detected the writing, you know. Of course you would. It was very wrong of me to persuade him. But I did, I assure you. He seemed in such trouble, and I thought. She made another break, and there was a faint deepening of colour in her cheeks. Suddenly, stupidly, his own adolescent cheeks began to glow. It became necessary to banish that sense of a duplicate topic forthwith. I can assure you, he said, now very earnestly, I never give a punishment, never, unless it is merited. I make that a rule. I, always make that a rule. I am very careful indeed. I am really sorry, she interrupted with frank contrition. It was silly of me. Lewisham felt unaccountably sorry she should have to apologize, and he spoke at once with the idea of checking the reddening of his face. I don't think that, he said with a sort of belated alacrity. Really, it was kind of you, you know, very kind of you indeed, and I know that I can quite understand that, your kindness ran away with me, and now poor little Teddy will get into worse trouble for letting me. Oh no, said Mr. Lewisham, perceiving an opportunity and trying not to smile his appreciation of what he was saying. I had no business to read this as I picked it up. Absolutely no business. Consequently, you won't take any notice of it? Really? Certainly not, said Mr. Lewisham. Her face lit with a smile, and Mr. Lewisham's relaxed in sympathy. It is nothing. It's the proper thing for me to do, you know. But so many people won't do it. Schoolmasters are not usually so chivalrous. He was chivalrous? The phrase acted like a spur. He obeyed a foolish impulse. If you like, he said. What? He didn't need to do this. I'll let him off. Really? I can. It's awfully kind of you. I don't mind, he said. It's nothing much, if you really think. He was full of self-applause for his scandalous sacrifice of justice. It's awfully kind of you, she said. It's nothing really, he explained. Nothing. Most people wouldn't, I know. Pause. It's all right, he said, really. He would have given worlds for something more to say, something witty and original, but nothing came. The pause lengthened. She glanced over her shoulder down the vacant avenue. This interview, this momentous series of things unsaid, was coming to an end. She looked at him hesitatingly and smiled again. She held out her hand. No doubt that was the proper thing to do. He took it, searching a void, tumultuous mind in vain. It's awfully kind of you, she said again as she did so. It don't matter a bit, said Mr. Lewisham, and sought vainly for some other saying, some doorway remark into new topics. Her hand was cool and soft and firm, the most delightful thing to grasp, and this observation outstead all other things. He held it for a moment, but nothing would come. They discovered themselves hand in hand. They both laughed and felt silly. They shook hands in the manner of quite intimate friends, and snatched their hands away awkwardly. She turned, glanced timidly at him over her shoulder, and hesitated. Goodbye, she said, and was suddenly walking from him. He bowed to her receding back, made the 17th century sweep with his college cap, and then some hitherto unexplored regions of his mind flashed into revolt. Hardly had she gone 6 paces when he was at her side again. I say, he said with a fearful sense of temerity, and raising his mortar board awkwardly as though he was passing a funeral. But that sheet of paper, yes, she said, surprised, quite naturally. May I have it? Why? He felt a breathless pleasure, like that of sliding down the slope of snow. I would like to have it. She smiled and raised her eyebrows, but his excitement was now too great for smiling. Look here, she said, and displayed the sheet crumpled into a ball. She laughed with a touch of effort. I don't mind that, said Mr. Lewisham, laughing too. He captured the paper by an insistent gesture and smoothed it out with fingers that trembled. You don't mind? He said. Mind what? If I keep it, why should I? Pause. Their eyes met again. There was an odd constraint about both of them, a palpitating interval of silence. I really must be going, she said suddenly, breaking the spell by an effort. She turned about him and left him with the crumpled piece of paper in the fist that held the book, the other hand lifting the mortarboard in a dignified salute again. He watched her receding figure. His heart was beating with remarkable rapidity. How light, how living she seemed. Little round flakes of sunlight raced down her as she went. She walked fast, then slowly, looking sideways once or twice, but not back, until she reached the park gates. Then she looked towards him, a remote friendly little figure, made a gesture of farewell, and disappeared. His face was flushed and his eyes bright. Curiously enough, he was out of breath. He stared for a long time at the vacant end of the avenue. Then he turned his eyes to his trophy, gripped against the closed and forgotten Horace in his hand. Chapter 3. The Wonderful Discovery. On Sunday it was Lewisham's duty to accompany the boarders twice to church. The boy sat in the gallery above the choirs facing the organ loft and at right angles to the general congregation. It was a prominent position and made him feel painfully conspicuous, except in moods of exceptional vanity, when he used to imagine that all these people were thinking how his forehead and his certificates accorded. He thought a lot in those days of his certificates and forehead, but little of his honest, healthy face behind it. To tell the truth, there was nothing very wonderful about his forehead. He rarely looked down the church, as he fancied to do so would be to meet the collective eye of the congregation regarding him, so that in the morning he was not able to see that the Frobisher's pew was empty until the litany. But in the evening, on the way to church, the Frobishers and their guest crossed the market square as his string of boys marched along the west side. And the guest was arrayed in a gay new dress, as if it was already Easter, and her face set in its dark hair came with a strange effect of mingled freshness and familiarity. She looked at him calmly. He felt very awkward and was cutting his new acquaintance, then hesitated and raised his hat with a jerk as if to Miss Frobisher. Neither lady acknowledged his salute, which may possibly have been a little unexpected. Then young Siddons dropped his hymn book, stooped to pick it up, and Lewisham almost fell over him. He entered church in a mood of black despair. But consolation of a sort came soon enough. As she took her seat, she distinctly glanced up at the gallery, and afterwards, as he knelt to pray, he peeped between his fingers and saw her looking up again. She was certainly not laughing at him. In those days, much of Lewisham's mind was still an unknown land to him. He believed, among other things, that he was always the same consistent, intelligent human being, whereas, under certain stimuli, he became no longer reasonable and disciplined, but a purely imaginative and emotional person. Music, for instance, carried him away, and particularly the effect of many voices in unison whirled him off from almost any state of mind to a fine, massive emotionality. And the evening service at Wortley Church. At the evening service, surplices were worn. The chanting and singing, the vague brilliance of the numerous candle flames, the multitudinous unanimity of the congregation down there, kneeling, rising, thunderously responding, invariably inebriated him, inspired him, if you will, and turned the prose of his life into poetry. And chance, coming to the aid of Dame Nature, dropped just the apt suggestion, into his now highly responsive ear. The second hymn was a simple and popular one, dealing with the theme of faith, hope, and charity, and having each verse ending with the word love. Conceive it, long drawn out and disarticulate. Faith will vanish into sight, hope be emptied to delight. Love in heaven will shine more bright, therefore give us love. At the third repetition of the refrain, Lewisham looked down across the cancel and met her eyes for a brief instant. He stopped singing abruptly. Then the consciousness of the serried ranks of faces below there came with almost overwhelming force upon him, and he dared not look at her again. He felt the blood rushing to his face. Love, the greatest of these, the greatest of all things. Better than fame, better than knowledge. So came the great discovery like a flood across his mind, pouring over it with the cadence of the hymn and sending a tide of pinking sympathy across his forehead. The rest of the service was phantasmagorial background to that great reality, a phantasmagorial background a little inclined to stare. He, Mr. Lewisham, was in love. Amen. He was so preoccupied that he found the whole congregation subsiding into their seats and himself still standing, rapt. He sat down spasmodically with an impact that seemed to him to re-echo through the church. As they came out of the porch into the thickening night, he seemed to see her everywhere. He fancied she had gone on in front, and he hurried up the boys in the hope of overtaking her. They pushed through the throng of dim people going homeward. Should he raise his hat to her again? But it was Susie Hopbrow in a light-coloured dress, a raven in dove's plumage. He felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. He would see her no more that night. He hurried from the school to his lodging. He wanted very urgently to be alone. He went upstairs to his little room and sat before the upturned box on which his butler's analogy was spread open. He did not go to the formality of lighting the candle. He leant back and gazed blissfully at the solitary planet that hung over the vicarage garden. He took out of his pocket a crumpled sheet of paper, smoothed and carefully refolded, covered with a writing not unlike that of Frobisher II, and after some maidenly hesitation pressed this treasure to his lips. The schema and the timetable hung in the darkness like the mere ghosts of themselves. Mrs. Munday called him thrice to his supper. He went out immediately after it was eaten and wandered under the stars until he came over the hill behind the town again and clambered up the back of the stile in sight of the Frobishers' house. He selected the only lit window as hers. Behind the blind, Mrs. Frobisher, 38, was busy with her curl papers. She used papers because they were better for the hair, and discussing certain neighbours in a fragmentary way with Mr. Frobisher, who was in bed. Presently she moved the candle to examine a faint discoloration of her complexion that rendered her uneasy. Outside, Mr. Lewisham, 18, stood watching the orange oblong for the best part of half an hour until it vanished and left the house, black and blank. Then he sighed deeply and returned home in a very glorious mood indeed. He awoke the next morning, feeling extremely serious, but not clearly remembering the overnight occurrences. His eye fell on his clock. The time was 6, and he had not heard the alarm. As a matter of fact, the alarm had not been wound up. He jumped out of bed at once and alighted upon his best trousers amorphously, dropped on the floor instead of methodically cast over the chair. As he soaped his head, he tried, according to his rules of revision, to remember the overnight reading. He could not for the life of him. The truth came to him as he was getting into his shirt. His head, struggling in its recesses, became motionless. The handless cuffs ceased to dangle for a minute. Then his head came through slowly with a surprised expression upon his face. He remembered. He remembered the thing as a bold discovery, and without a touch of emotion. With all the achromatic clearness, the unromantic colourlessness of the early morning. Yes, he had it now quite distinctly. There had been no overnight reading. He was in love. The proposition jarred with some vague thing in his mind. He stood staring for a space and then began looking about absent-mindedly for his collar stud. He paused in front of his schema, regarding it. Chapter 4. Raised Eyebrows. Work must be done anyhow, said Mr. Lewisham, but never had the extraordinary advantages of open-air study presented themselves so vividly. Before breakfast, he took half an hour of open-air reading along the allotments lane near the Frobishers' house. After breakfast and before school, he went through the avenue with a book and returned from school to his lodgings circuitously through the avenue, and so back to the avenue for 30 minutes or so before afternoon school. When Mr. Lewisham was not looking over the top of his book during these periods of open-air study, then commonly he was glancing over his shoulder, and at last, who should he see but... He saw her out of the corner of his eye, and he turned away at once, pretending not to have seen her. His whole being was suddenly irradiated with emotion. The hands holding his book gripped it very tightly. He did not glance back again, but walked slowly and steadfastly, reading an ode that he could not have translated to save his life, and listening acutely for her approach. And after an interminable time, as it seemed, came a faint football and the swish of skirts behind him. He felt as though his head was directed forward by a clutch of iron. "Mr. Lewisham," she said close to him, and he turned with a quality of movement that was almost convulsive. He raised his cap clumsily. He took her extended hand by an afterthought and held it until she withdrew it. "I am so glad to have met you," she said. "So am I," said Lewisham simply. They stood facing one another for an expressive moment, and then, by a movement, she indicated her intention to walk along the avenue with him. "I wanted so much," she said, looking down at her feet, "to thank you for letting Teddy off, you know. That is why I wanted to see you." Lewisham took his first step beside her. "And it's odd, isn't it," she said, looking up into his face, "that I should meet you here in just the same place. I believe, yes, the very same place we met before." Mr. Lewisham was tongue-tied. "Do you often come here?" she said. "Well," he considered, and his voice was most unreasonably hoarse when he spoke. No. That is, at least not often. Now and then. In fact, I like it rather for reading and that sort of thing. It's so quiet. I suppose you read a great deal. When one teaches, one has to. But you... I'm rather fond of reading, certainly. Are you?" "I love it." Mr. Lewisham was glad she loved reading. He would have been disappointed had she answered differently. But she spoke with real fervour. She loved reading. It was pleasant. She would understand him a little, perhaps. "Of course," she went on, "I'm not clever like some people are. And I have read 2 books as I get hold of them." "So do I," said Mr. Lewisham. "For the matter of that, have you read Carlyle?" The conversation was now fairly underway. They were walking side by side beneath the swaying boughs. Mr. Lewisham's sensations were ecstatic, married only by a dread of some casual boy coming up upon them. She had not read much Carlyle. She had always wanted to, even from quite a little girl. She had heard so much about him. She knew he was a really great writer, a very great writer indeed. All she had read of him she liked. She could say that, as much as she liked anything, and she had seen his house in Chelsea. Lewisham, whose knowledge of London had been obtained by excursion trips on 6 or 7 isolated days, was much impressed by this. It seemed to put her at once on a footing of intimacy with this imposing personality. It had never occurred to him at all vividly that these great writers had real abiding places. She gave him a few descriptive touches that made the house suddenly real and distinctive to him. She lived quite near, she said, at least within walking distance, in Clapham. He instantly forgot the vague design of lending her his Sartorizatus in his curiosity to learn more about her home. Clapham, that's almost in London, isn't it? He said. Quite, she said, but she volunteered no further information about her domestic circumstances. I like London, she generalized, and especially in winter. And she produced to praise London, its public libraries, its shops, the multitudes of people, the facilities for doing what you like, the concerts one could go to, the theatres. It seemed she moved in fairly good society. There's always something to see, even if you only want to go out for a walk, she said. And down here, there's nothing to read but idle novels, and those not new. Mr. Lewisham was regretful to admit the lack of such culture and mental activity in Wortley. It made him feel terribly her inferior. He had only his bookishness and his certificates to set against it all, and she had seen Carlyle's house. Down here, she said, there's nothing to talk about but scandal. It was so true. At the corner by the stile, beyond which the willows were splendid against the blue with silvery aments and golden pollen, they turned by mutual impulse and retraced their steps. I've simply had no one to talk to down here, she said. Not what I call talking. I hope, said Lewisham, making a resolute plunge, perhaps while you are staying at Wortley. He paused perceptibly, and she, following his eyes, saw a voluminous black figure approaching. We may, said Mr. Lewisham, resuming his remark, chance to meet again, perhaps. He had been about to challenge her to a deliberate meeting. A certain delightful tangle of paths that followed the bank of the river had been in his mind. But the apparition of Mr. George Bonover, headmaster of the Wortley Proprietary School, chilled him amazingly. Dame Nature no doubt had arranged the meeting of our young couple, but about Bonover she seems to have been culpably careless. She now receded inimitably, and Mr. Lewisham, with the most unpleasant feelings, found himself face to face with a typical representative of a social organization which objects very strongly, inter alia, to promiscuous conversation on the part of the young unmarried junior master. Chance to meet again, perhaps, said Mr. Lewisham with a sudden lack of spirit. I hope so too, she said. Pause. Mr. Bonover's features, and particularly a bushy pair of black eyebrows, were now very near. Those eyebrows already raised, apparently to express a refined astonishment. Is this Mr. Bonover approaching? She asked. Yes. Prolonged pause. Would he stop and accost them? At any rate, this frightful silence must end. Mr. Lewisham sought in his mind for some remark wherewith to convey his employer's approach. He was surprised to find his mind a desert. He made a colossal effort. If they could only talk, if they could only seem at their ease. But this blank incapacity was eloquent of guilt. Ah, it's a lovely day though, said Mr. Lewisham, isn't it? She agreed with him. Isn't it? She said. And then Mr. Bonover passed, forehead tight reefed, so to speak, and lips impressively compressed. Mr. Lewisham raised his mortarboard, and to his astonishment, Mr. Bonover responded with a markedly formal salute, mock clerical hat sweeping circuitously, and the regard of a searching, disapproving eye, and so passed. Lewisham was overcome with astonishment at his improvement on the nod of their ordinary commerce. And so this terrible incident terminated for this time. He felt a momentary gust of indignation. After all, why should Bonover or anyone interfere with his talking to a girl if he chose? And for all he knew, they might have been properly introduced by young Frobisher, say. Nevertheless, Lewisham's springtide mood relapsed into winter. He was, he felt, singularly stupid for the rest of their conversation, and the delightful feeling of enterprise that had hitherto inspired and astonished him when talking of her had shriveled beyond contempt. He was glad, positively glad, when things came to an end. At the park gate, she held out her hand. "I'm afraid I have interrupted your reading," she said. "Not a bit," said Mr. Lewisham, warming slightly. "I don't know when I've enjoyed a conversation. It was a breach of etiquette. I am afraid, my speaking to you, but I did so want to thank you." "Don't mention it," said Mr. Lewisham, secretly impressed by the etiquette. "Goodbye." He stood hesitatingly by the lodge and then turned back up the avenue in order not to be seen to follow her too closely up the West Street. And then, still walking away from her, he remembered that he had not lent her a book as he had planned, nor made any arrangement ever to meet her again. She might leave Wortley for the amenities of Clapham. He stopped and stood irresolute. Should he run after her? Then he recalled Bonover's enigmatical expression of face. He decided that to pursue her would be altogether too conspicuous. Yet, so he stood in inglorious hesitation while the seconds passed. He reached his lodgings at last to find Mrs. Munday halfway through dinner. "You get them books of yours," said Mrs. Munday, who took a motherly interest in them. "And you read and you read, and you take no account of time. And now you will have to eat your dinner half cold, and no time for it to settle proper before you goes off to school. It's ruination to a stomach, such ways." "Oh, never mind my stomach, Mrs. Munday," said Lewisham, roused from a tangled and apparently gloomy meditation. "That's my affair." Quite crossly he spoke for him. "I'd rather have a good sensible acting stomach than a full head," said Mrs. Munday, "any day." "I'm different, you see," snapped Mr. Lewisham, and relapsed into silence and gloom. "Hoity-toity," said Mrs. Munday under her breath. Chapter 5. Hesitations. Mr. Bonover, having fully matured a hint suitable for the occasion, dropped it in the afternoon while Lewisham was superintending cricket practice. He made a few remarks about the prospects of the first 11 by way of introduction, and Lewisham agreed with him that Frobisher, the first, looked like shaping very well this season. A pause followed, and the headmaster hummed. "By the by," he said, as if making conversation and still watching the play, "I understood that you were a stranger to Wortley." "Yes," said Lewisham, "that's so." "You have made friends in the neighbourhood?" Lewisham was troubled with a cough, and his ears, though confounded ears, brightened. "Yes," he said, recovering. "Oh, yes, I have." "Local people, I presume?" "Well, no, not exactly." The brightness spread from Lewisham's ears over his face. "I saw you," said Bonover, "talking to a young lady in the avenue. Her face was somehow quite familiar to me." "Who was she?" Should he say she was a friend of the Frobishers? In that case, Bonover, in his insidious, amiable way, might talk to Frobisher's parents and make things disagreeable for her. "She was," said Lewisham, flushing deeply with distress on his honesty and dropping his voice to a mumble, an old friend of my mother's. In fact, I met her once at Salisbury." "Where?" "Salisbury." "And her name?" "Smith," said Lewisham, a little hastily, and repenting the lie even as it left his lips. "Well hit, Harris," shouted Bonover, and began to clap his hands. "Well hit, sir." "Harris shapes very well," said Mr. Lewisham. "Very," said Mr. Bonover. "And what is it?" Ah, I was just remarking the odd resemblances there are in the world. There is a Miss Henderson or Henson stopping with the Frobishers in the very same town. In fact, the very picture of your Miss Smith, said Lewisham, meeting his eye and recovering full crimson note of his first blush. It's odd, said Bonover, regarding him pensively. Very odd, mumbled Lewisham, cursing his own stupidity and looking away. Very, very odd, said Bonover. In fact, said Bonover, turning towards the schoolhouse, I hardly expected it of you, Mr. Lewisham. Expected what, sir? But Mr. Bonover feigned to be already out of earshot. Damn, said Mr. Lewisham. Oh, damn, a most objectionable expression and rare with him in those days. He had half a mind to follow the headmaster and ask him if he doubted his word. It was only too evident what the answer would be. He stood for a minute undecided, then turned on his heel and marched homeward with savage steps. His muscles quivered as he walked, and his face twitched. The tumult of his mind settled at last into angry indignation. Confound him, said Mr. Lewisham, arguing the matter out with his bedroom furniture. Why the devil can't he mind his own business? Mind your own business, sir, shouted Mr. Lewisham at the wash-hand stand. Confound you, sir, mind your own business. The wash-hand stand did. You overrate your power, sir, said Mr. Lewisham, a little mollified. Understand me, I am my own master out of school. Nevertheless, for 4 days and some hours after Mr. Bonover's hint, Mr. Lewisham so far observed its implications as to abandon open-air study and struggle with diminishing success to observe the spirit as well as the letter of his timetable prescriptions. For the most part, he fretted at accumulating tasks, did them with slipshod energy, or looked out of window. The career constituent insisted that to meet and talk to his girl again meant reproof, worry, interference with his work for his matriculation, the destruction of all discipline, and he saw the entire justice of the insistence. It was nonsense, this being in love. There wasn't such a thing as love outside of trashy novelettes, and forthwith his mind went off at a tangent to her eyes under the shadow of her hat brim, and had to be lugged back by main force. On Thursday, when he was returning from school, he saw her far away down the street and hurried in to avoid her, looking ostentatiously in the opposite direction. But that was a turning point. Shame overtook him. On Friday, his belief in love was warm and living again, and his heart full of remorse for laggard days. On Saturday morning, his preoccupation with her was so vivid that it distracted him even while he was teaching that most teachable subject, algebra, and by the end of the school hours, the issue was decided and the career in headlong rout. That afternoon he would go, whatever happened, and see her and speak to her again. The thought of Bonover arose only to be dismissed. And besides, Bonover took a siesta early in the afternoon. Yes, he would go out and find her and speak to her. Nothing should stop him. Once that decision was taken, his imagination became riotous with things he might say, attitudes he might strike, and a multitude of vague, fine dreams about her. He would say this, he would say that. His mind would do nothing but circle round this wonderful pose of lover. What a cur he had been to hide from her so long! What could he have been thinking about? How could he explain it to her when the meeting really came? Suppose he was very frank. He considered the limits of frankness. Would she believe he had not seen her on Thursday, if he assured her that it was so? And most horrible, in the midst of all this, came Bonover with a request that he would take duty of the cricket field instead of Dunkerley that afternoon. Dunkerley was the senior assistant master, Lewisham's sole colleague. The last vestige of disapprobation had vanished from Bonover's manner. Asking a favour was his autocratic way of proffering the olive branch. But it came to Lewisham as a cruel imposition, For a fateful moment, he trembled on the brink of acquiescence. In a flash came a vision of the long duty of the afternoon, she possibly packing for Clapham all the while. He turned white. Mr. Bonover watched his face. "No," said Lewisham bluntly, saying all he was sure of, and forthwith racking his unpractised mind for an excuse. "I'm sorry I can't oblige you, but my arrangements, I've made arrangements, in fact, for the afternoon." Mr. Bonover's eyebrows went up at this obvious lie, and the glow of his suavity faded. "You see," he said, "Mr. Bonover expects a friend this afternoon, and we rather want Mr. Dunkerley to make 4 at croquet." "I'm sorry," said Mr. Lewisham, still resolute, and making a mental note that Bonover would be playing croquet. "You don't play croquet by any chance?" said Mr. Bonover. "No," said Lewisham. "I haven't an idea." "If Mr. Dunkerley had asked you?" persisted Bonover, knowing Lewisham's respect for etiquette. "Oh, it wasn't on that account," said Lewisham, and Bonover, with eyebrows still raised and a general air of outraged astonishment, left him standing there, white and stiff, and wondering at his extraordinary temerity. Chapter 6. The Scandalous Ramble. As soon as school was dismissed, Lewisham made a jail delivery of his outstanding impositions and hurried back to his lodgings to spend the time until his dinner was ready. Well, it seems hardly fair, perhaps, to Lewisham to tell this. It is doubtful indeed whether a male novelist's duty to his sex should not restrain him. Mr. Lewisham brushed his hair with elaboration and ruffled it picturesquely, tried the effect of all his ties and selected a white one, dusted his boots with an old pocket handkerchief, changed his trousers because the weekday pair was minutely frayed at the heels, and inked the elbows of his coat where the stitches were a little white. And to be still more intimate, he studied his callow appearance in the glass from various points of view, and decided that his nose might have been a little smaller with advantage. Directly after dinner he went out, and by the shortest path to the allotment lane, telling himself he did not care if he met Bonover forthwith in the street. He did not know precisely what he intended to do, but he was quite clear that he meant to see the girl he had met in the avenue. He knew he should see her. A sense of obstacles merely braced him and was pleasurable. He went up the stone steps out of the lane to the stile that overlooked the Frobishers, the stile from which he had watched the Frobisher bedroom. There he seated himself with his arms folded in full view of the house. That was at 10 minutes to 2. At 20 minutes to 3 he was still sitting there, but his hands were deep in his jacket pockets, and he was scowling and kicking his foot against the steps with an impatient monotony. His needless glasses had been thrust into his waistcoat pocket, where they remained throughout the afternoon, and his cap was tilted a little back from his forehead and exposed a wisp of hair. 1 or 2 people had gone down the lane, and he had pretended not to see them, and a couple of hedge sparrows chasing each other along the side of the sunlit, wind-rippled field had been his chief entertainment. It is unaccountable, no doubt, but he felt angry with her as the time crept on. His expression lowered. He heard someone going by in the lane behind him. He would not look round. It annoyed him to think of people seeing him in this position. His once eminent discretion, though overthrown, still made muffled protests at the afternoon's enterprise. The feet down the lane stopped close at hand. "Stare away," said Lewisham between his teeth. And then began mysterious noises, a violent rustle of hedge twigs, a something like a very light foot tapping. Curiosity boarded Lewisham and carried him after the briefest struggle. He looked round, and there she was, her back to him, reaching after the spiky, blossoming blackthorn that crested the opposite hedge. Remarkable accident, she had not seen him. In a moment, Lewisham's legs were flying over the stile. He went down the steps in the bank with such impetus that it carried him up into the prickly bushes beside her. "Allow me," he said, too excited to see she was not astonished. "Mr. Lewisham," she said in feigned surprise, and stood away to give him room at the blackthorn. "Which spike will you have?" he cried, overjoyed. "The whitest? The highest? Any." That piece she chose haphazard, with a black spike sticking out from it. A mass of snowy blossom it was against the April sky, and Lewisham, straggling for it, it was by no means the most accessible, saw with fantastic satisfaction a lengthy scratch flash white on his hand and turn to red. "Higher up the lane," he said, descending triumphant and breathless. "There is blackthorn. This cannot compare for a moment." She laughed and looked at him as he stood there flushed, his eyes triumphant, with an unpremeditated approval. In church in the gallery, with his face foreshortened, he had been effective in a way, but this was different. "Show me," she said, though she knew this was the only place for blackthorn for a mile in either direction. "I knew I should see you," he said, by way of answer. "I felt sure I should see you today. It was our last chance almost," she answered, with as frank a quality of avowal. "I am going home to London on Monday." "And you," he cried, triumphant. "To Clapham?" he asked. "Yes, I have got a situation. You did not know that I was a shorthand clerk and typewriter, did you? I am. I have just left the school, the Grogram School. And now there is an old gentleman who wants an amanuensis." "So you know shorthand," said he. "That accounts for the stylographic pen. Those lines were written, I still have them." She smiled and raised her eyebrows. "Here," said Mr. Lewisham, tapping his breast pocket. "This lane," he said. Their talk was curiously inconsecutive. "Some way along this lane, over the hill and down, there is a gate. And that goes, it opens into a path that runs along the river bank. Have you been?" "No," she said. "It's the best walk about Wortley. It brings you out upon Immering Common. You must before you go." "Now?" she said, with her eyes dancing. "Why not? I told Mrs. Frobisher I should be back by 4, she said. "It's a walk not to be lost." "Very well," she said. "The trees are all budding," said Mr. Lewisham. "The rushes are shooting, and all along the edge of the river there are millions of little white flowers floating on the water. I don't know the names of them, but they're fine. May I carry that branch of blossom?" As he took it, their hands touched momentarily, and there came another of those significant gaps. "Look at those clouds," said Lewisham abruptly, remembering the remark he had been about to make and waving the white froth of blackthorn. "And look at the blue between them. It's perfectly splendid. Of all the fine weather, the best has been kept for now. My last day, my very last day." And off these two young people went, together in a highly electrical state, to the infinite astonishment of Mrs. Frobisher, who was looking out of the attic window, stepping out manfully, and finding the whole world lit and splendid for their entertainment. The things they discovered and told each other that afternoon down by the river. That spring was wonderful, young leaves beautiful, bud scales astonishing things, and clouds dazzling and stately, with an air of supreme originality, and their naive astonishment to find one another in agreement upon these novel delights. It seemed to them quite outside the play of accident that they should have met each other. They went by the path that runs among the trees along the river bank, and she must needs repent and wish to take the lower one, the towing path, before they had gone 300 yards. So Lewisham had to find a place fit for her descent, where a friendly tree proffered its protruding roots as a convenient balustrade, and down she clambered with her hand in his. Then a water vole washing his whiskers gave occasion for a sudden touching of hands, and the intimate confidence of whispers and silence together, after which Lewisham essayed to gather her a marshmallow at the peril, as it was judged, of his life, and gained it together with a bootful of water. And at the gate by the black and shiny lock where the path breaks away from the river, she overcame him by an unexpected feat, climbing gleefully to the top rail with the support of his hand, and leaping down, a figure of light and grace, to the ground. They struck boldly across the meadows, which were gay with ladies' smock, and he walked by special request between her and 3 matronly cows, feeling as Perseus might have done when he fended off the sea monster, and so by the mill and up the steep path to Immering Common. Across the meadows, Lewisham had broached the subject of her occupation. "And you are really going away from here to be an amanuensis?" he said, and started her upon the theme of herself, a theme she treated with a specialist's enthusiasm. They dealt with it by the comparative methods, and neither noticed the light was out of the sky until the soft feet of the advancing shower had stolen right upon them. "Look," said he, "yonder, a shed," and they ran together. She ran laughing and yet swiftly and lightly. He pulled her through the hedge by both hands and released her skirt from an amorous bramble, and so they came into a little black shed in which a rusty harrow of gigantic proportions sheltered. He noted how she still kept her breath after that run. She sat down on the harrow and hesitated. "I must take off my hat," she said. "The rain will spot it." And so he had a chance of admiring the sincerity of her curls. Not that he had ever doubted them. She stooped over her hat, pocket handkerchief in hand, daintily wiping off the silvery drops. He stood up at the opening of the shed and looked at the country outside through the veil of the soft vehemence of the April shower. "There's room for 2 on this harrow," she said. He made inarticulate sounds of refusal, then came and sat down beside her, close beside her, so that he was almost touching her. He felt a fantastic desire to take her in his arms and kiss her, and overcame the madness by an effort. "I don't even know your name," he said, taking refuge from his whirling thoughts in conversation. "Henderson," she said. "Miss Henderson?" She smiled in his face, hesitated. "Yes, Miss Henderson." Her eyes, her atmosphere were wonderful. He had never felt quite the same sensation before, a strange excitement, almost like a faint echo of tears. He was demanding her Christian name, for calling her dear, and seeing what she would say. He plunged headlong into a rambling description of Bonover and how he had told a lie about her and had called her Mrs. Smith, and so escaped this unaccountable emotional crisis. The whispering of the rain about them sank and died, and the sunlight struck vividly across the distant woods beyond Immering. Just then they had fallen on a silence again that was full of daring thoughts for Mr. Lewisham. He moved his arm suddenly and placed it so that it was behind her and the frame of the harrow. "Let us go on now," she said abruptly. "The rain has stopped." "The little path goes straight to Immering," said Mr. Lewisham. "But 4 o'clock?" He drew out his watch, and his eyebrows went up. It was already nearly 4:15. "Is it past 4?" she asked, and abruptly they were face to face with parting. That Lewisham had to take duty at 5:30 seemed a thing utterly trivial. "Surely," he said, only slowly releasing what this parting meant. "But must you? I want to talk to you." "Haven't you been talking to me?" "It isn't that. Besides, no." She stood looking at him. "I promised to be home by 4, she said. "Mrs. Frobisher has tea. We may never have a chance to see one another again." "Well?" Lewisham suddenly turned very white. "Don't leave me," he said, breaking the tense silence, and with a sudden stress in his voice, "don't leave me. Stop with me yet for a little while. You can lose your way." "You seem to think," she said, forcing a laugh, that I live without eating and drinking. I have wanted to talk to you so much. The first time I saw you, at first I dared not. I did not know you would let me talk, and now, just as I am happy, you are going." He stopped abruptly. Her eyes were downcast. "No," she said, tracing a curve with the point of her shoe. "No, I am not going." Lewisham restrained an impulse to shout. "Will you come to Immering?" he cried, and as they went along the narrow path through the wet grass, he began to tell her with simple frankness how he cared for her company. "I would not change this," he said, casting about for an offer to reject. "For anything in the world. I shall not be back for duty. I don't care. I don't care what happens so long as we have this afternoon." "Nor I," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said in an outburst of gratitude. "Oh, thank you for coming," and held out his hand. She took it and pressed it, and so they went on hand in hand until the village street was reached. Their high resolve to play truant at all costs had begotten a wonderful sense of fellowship. "I can't call you Miss Henderson," he said. "You know I can't. You know I must have your Christian name." "Ethel," she told him. "Ethel," he said, and looked at her, gathering courage as he did so. "Ethel," he repeated. "It's a pretty name, but no name is quite pretty enough for you, Ethel, dear." The little shop in Immering lay back behind a garden full of wallflowers and was kept by a very fat and very cheerful little woman who insisted on regarding them as brother and sister and calling them both dearie. These points conceded, she gave them an admirable tea of astonishing cheapness. Lewisham did not like the second condition very much because it seemed to touch a little on his latest enterprise. But the tea and the bread and butter and the wort jam were like no food on earth. There were wallflowers, heavy-scented, in a jug upon the table, and Ethel admired them, and when they set out again, the little old lady insisted on her taking a bunch with her. It was after they left Immering that this ramble, properly speaking, became scandalous. The sun was already a golden ball above the blue hills in the west. It turned our two young people into little figures of flame, and yet, instead of going homeward, they took the Wentworth Road that plunges into the foreshore woods. Behind them, the moon, almost full, hung in the blue sky above the treetops, ghostly and indistinct, and slowly gathered to itself such light as the setting sun left for it in the sky. Going out of Immering, they began to talk of the future, and for the very young lover there is no future but the immediate future. "You must write to me," he said, and she told him she wrote such silly letters. "But I shall have reams to write to you," he told her. "How are you to write to me?" she asked, as they discussed a new obstacle between them. It would never do to write home, never. She was sure of that with an absolute assurance. "My mother," she said, and stopped. That prohibition cut him, for at that time he had the makings of a voluminous letter writer. Yet it was only what one might expect. The whole world was unpropitious, obdurate indeed, a splendid isolation, à deux. Perhaps she might find some place where letters might be sent to her, yet that seemed to her deceitful. So these two young people wandered on, full of their discovery of love, and yet so full of the shyness of adolescence that the word love never passed their lips that day. Yet as they talked on, and the kindly dusk gathered about them, their speech and their hearts came very close together. But their speech would seem so threadbare, written down in cold blood, that I must not put it here. To them it was not threadbare. When at last they came down the long road into Wortley, the silent trees were black as ink, and the moonlight made her face pallid and wonderful, and her eyes shone like stars. She still carried the blackthorn from which most of the blossoms had fallen. The fragrant wallflowers were fragrant still, and far away, softened by the distance, the Wortley band, performing publicly outside the vicarage for the first time that year, was playing with unctuous slowness a sentimental air. I don't know if the reader remembers it, that favourite melody of the early 80s. Sweet dreamland faces passing to and fro bring back to memory days of long ago, was the essence of it, and very slow and tender, and with an accompaniment of pum pum. Pathetically cheerful, that pum pum, hopelessly cheerful indeed against the dirge of the air, a dirge accentuated by sporadic vocalization. But to young people, things come differently. I love music, she said. So do I, said he. They came on down the steepness of West Street. They walked athwart the metallic and leathery tumult of sound into the light cast by the little circle of yellow lamps. Several people saw them and wondered what the boys and girls were coming to nowadays, and one eyewitness even subsequently described their carriage as brazen. Mr. Lewisham was wearing his mortarboard cap of office. There was no mistaking him. They passed the proprietary school and saw a yellow picture framed and glazed of Mr. Bonover taking duty for his aberrant assistant master. And outside the Frobisher house at last they parted perforce. "Goodbye," he said for the third time. "Goodbye, Ethel." She hesitated, then suddenly she darted towards him. He felt her hands upon his shoulders, her lips soft and warm upon his cheek. And before he could take hold of her, she had eluded him and had flitted into the shadow of the house. "Goodbye," came her sweet, clear voice out of the shadow, and while he yet hesitated an answer, the door opened. He saw her, black in the doorway, heard some indistinct words, and then the door closed, and he was alone in the moonlight, his cheeks still glowing from her lips. So ended Mr. Lewisham's first day with love. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. And after the day of love came the days of reckoning. Mr. Lewisham was astonished, overwhelmed almost by that reckoning, as it slowly and steadily unfolded itself. The wonderful emotions of Saturday carried him through Sunday, and he made it up with the neglected schemer by assuring it that she was his inspiration, and that he would work for her 1,000 times better than he could possibly work for himself. That was certainly not true, and indeed he found himself wondering whither the interest had vanished out of his theological examination of Butler's analogy. The Frobishers were not at church for either service. He speculated rather anxiously. Why? Monday dawned coldly and clearly, a Herbert Spencer of a day, and he went to school sedulously assuring himself there was nothing to apprehend. Day boys were whispering in the morning, apparently about him, and Frobisher II was in great request. Lewisham overheard a fragment. "My mother was in a wax," said Frobisher II. At 12 came an interview with Bonover, and voices presently rising in angry altercation and audible to Senior Assistant Dunkerley through the closed study door. Then Lewisham walked across the schoolroom, staring straight before him, his cheeks very bright. Thereby Dunkerley's mind was prepared for the news that came the next morning over the exercise books. "When?" said Dunkerley. "End of next term," said Lewisham. "About this girl's that's been staying at the Frobishers?" "Yes. She is a pretty bit of goods, but it will mess up the matric next June," said Dunkerley. "That's what I'm sorry for. It's scarcely to be expected he'll give you leave to attend the exam." "He won't," said Lewisham shortly, and opened his first exercise book. He found it difficult to talk. "He is a greaser," said Dunkerley. "But there, what can you expect from Durham?" For Bonover had only a Durham degree, and Dunkerley, having none, inclined to be particular. Therewith Dunkerley lapsed into a sympathetic and busy rustling over his own pile of exercises. It was not until the heap had been reduced to a book or so that he spoke again, an elaborate point. Male and female, he created them, said Dunkley, ticking his way down the page. Which, tick tick, was damned hard, tick tick, on assistant masters. He closed the book with a snap and flung it on the floor behind him. You're lucky, he said. I did think I should be first to get out of this scandalizing hole. You're lucky. It's always acting down here. Running on parents and guardians round every corner. That's what I object to in my life in the country. It's so confoundedly artificial. I shall take jolly good care I get out of it just as soon as I ever can. You bet. And work those patents? Rather, my boy, yes. Work those patents. The patent square top bottle. Lord, once let me get to London. I think I shall have a shot at London, said Lewisham. And then the experienced Dunkley, being one of the kindest young men alive, forgot certain private ambitions of his own. He cherished dreams of amazing patents and bethought him of agents. He proceeded to give a list of these necessary helpers of the assistant master at the gangway, Orellana, Gabitas, the Lancaster Gate Agency, and the rest of them. He knew them all intimately. He had been a Nix 8 years. Of course, that Kensington thing may come off, said Dunkley, but it's best not to wait. I tell you frankly, the chances are against you. The Kensington thing was an application for admission to the Normal School of Science at South Kensington, which Lewisham had made in a sanguine moment. There being an inadequate supply of qualified science teachers in England, the Science and Art Department is wont to offer free instruction at its great central school and a guinea a week to select young pedagogues who will bind themselves to teach science after their training is over. Dunkley had been in the habit of applying for several years, always in vain, and Lewisham had seen no harm in following his example. But then Dunkley had no green-grey certificates. So Lewisham spent all that duty left him of the next day composing a letter to copy out and send to several scholastic agencies. In this he gave a brief but appreciative sketch of his life and enlarged upon his discipline and educational methods. At the end of a long and decorative schedule of his certificates and distinctions, beginning with a Good Conduct Prize at the age of 8, a considerable amount of time was required to recopy this document, but his modesty upheld him. After a careful consideration of the timetable, he set aside the midday hour for correspondence. He found that his work in mathematics and classics was already some time in arrears, and the test he had sent to his correspondence tutor during those troublous days after the meeting with Bonover in the avenue came back grotesquely endorsed. Below par standard. This last experience was so unprecedented and annoyed him so much that, for a space, he contemplated retorting with a sarcastic letter to the tutor. And then came the Easter recess, and he had to go home and tell his mother, with a careful suppression of details, that he was leaving Wortley. Where you have been getting on so well, cried his mother. But that dear old lady had one consolation. She observed he had given up his glasses. He had forgotten to bring them with him, and her secret fear of grave optical troubles that were being kept from her was alleviated. Sometimes he had moods of intense regret for the folly of that walk. One such came after the holidays, when the necessity of revising the dates of the schema brought before his mind, for the first time quite clearly, the practical issue of the first struggle with all those mysterious and powerful influences of springtime sets a-stirring. His dream of success and fame had been very real and dear to him, and the realization of the inevitable postponement of his long-anticipated matriculation, the doorway to all the other great things, took him abruptly, like an actual physical sensation in his chest. He sprang up, pen in hand, in the midst of his corrections, and began pacing up and down the room. "What a fool I have been," he cried. "What a fool I have been." He flung the pen on the floor and made a rush at an ill-drawn attempt upon a girl's face that adorned the end of his room, the visible witness of his slavery. He tore this down and sent the fragments of it scattering. Fool! It was a relief, a definite abandonment. He stared for a moment at the destruction he had made, and then went back to the revision of the timetable with a mutter about silly spooning. That was one mood, the rarer one. He watched the post with far more eagerness for the address to which he might write to her than for any reply to those reiterated letters of application, the writing of which now outstead Horace and the higher mathematics, Lewisham's term for conics, from his attention. Indeed, he spent more time meditating the letter to her than even the schedule of his virtues had required. Yet the letters of application were wonderful compositions. Each had a new pen to itself, and was for the first page at least, in a handwriting far above even his usual high standard. And day after day passed, and that particular letter he hoped for still did not come. His moods were complicated by the fact that, in spite of his studied reticence on the subject, the reason of his departure did, in an amazingly short time, get all over Wortley. It was understood that he had been discovered to be fast, and Ethel's behaviour was animadverted upon with complacent indignation, if the phrase may be allowed, by the ladies of the place. Pretty looks were too often a snare. One boy, his ear was warmed, therefore, once called aloud Ethel as Lewisham went by. The curate, a curate of the pale-faced, large-knuckled, nervous sort, now passed him without acknowledgement of his existence. Mrs. Bonover took occasion to tell him that he was a mere boy, and once Mrs. Frobisher sniffed quite threateningly at him when she passed him in the street. She did it so suddenly, she made him jump. This general disapproval inclined him at times to depression, but in certain moods he found it exhilarating, and several times he professed himself to Dunkerley not a little of a blade. In others he told himself he bore it for her sake. Anyhow, he had to bear it. He began to find out, too, how little the world feels the need of a young man of 19. He called himself 19, though he had several months of 18 still to run, even though he adds prizes for good conduct, general improvement and arithmetic, and advanced certificates signed by a distinguished engineer and headed with a royal arms, guaranteed his knowledge of geometrical drawing, nautical astronomy, animal physiology, physiography, inorganic chemistry, and building construction, to his youth and strength and energy. At first he had imagined headmasters clutching at the chance of him, and presently he found himself clutching eagerly at them. He began to put a certain urgency into his applications for vacant posts, an urgency that helped him not at all. The applications grew longer and longer until they ran to 4 sheets of notepaper, a pennyworth in fact. "I can assure you," he would write, "that you will find me a loyal and devoted assistant," much in that strain. Dunkerley pointed out that Bonover's testimonial ignored the question of moral character and discipline in a marked manner, and Bonover refused to alter it. He was willing to do what he could to help Lewisham, in spite of the way he had been treated, but unfortunately his conscience. Once or twice Lewisham misquoted the testimonial to no purpose, and May was halfway through, and South Kensington was silent. The future was grey. And in the depths of his doubt and disappointment came her letter. It was typewritten on thin paper. "Dear," she wrote simply, and it seemed to him the most sweet and wonderful of all possible modes of address, though as a matter of fact it was because she had forgotten his Christian name, and afterwards forgotten the blank she had left for it. "Dear, I could not write before because I have no room at home now where I can write a letter, and Mrs. Frobisher told my mother falsehoods about you. My mother had surprised me dreadfully. I did not think it of her. She told me nothing, but of that I must tell you in another letter. I am too angry to write about it now. Even now you cannot write back, for you must not send letters here. It would never do. But I think of you, dear. The dear had been erased and rewritten, and I must write and tell you so, and of that nice walk we had if I never write again. I am very busy now, my work is rather difficult, and I'm afraid I'm a little stupid. It is hard to be interested in anything just because that is how you have to live, is it not? I dare say you sometimes feel the same of school, but I suppose everybody is doing things they don't like. I don't know when I shall come to Wortley again, if ever, but very likely you will be coming to London. Mrs. Frobisher said the most horrid things. It would be nice if you could come to London, because then perhaps you might see me. There is a big boys' school at Chelsea, and when I go by it every morning, I wish you were there. Then you would come out in your cap and gown as I went by. Suppose some day I was to see you there suddenly. So it ran with singularly little information in it, and ended quite abruptly. Goodbye, dear, scribbled in pencil, and then think of me sometimes. Reading it, and especially that opening dear, made Lewisham feel the strangest sensation in his throat and chest, almost as though he was going to cry. So he laughed instead and read it again, and went to and fro in his little room with his eyes bright, and that precious writing held in his hand. That dear was just as if she had spoken, a voice suddenly heard. He thought of her farewell, clear and sweet, out of the shadow of the moonlit house. But why that if I never write again, and that abrupt ending? Of course he would think of her. It was her only letter. In a little time its creases were worn through. Early in June came a loneliness that suddenly changed into almost intolerable longing to see her. He had vague dreams of going to London, to Clapham, to find her. But you do not find people in Clapham as you do in Wortley. He spent an afternoon writing and rewriting a lengthy letter against the day when her address should come, if it was to come. He prowled about the village disconsolately, and at last set off about 7 and retraced by moonlight almost every step of that one memorable walk of theirs. In the blackness of the shed, he worked himself up to the pitch of talking as if she were present, and he said some fine, brave things. He found the little old lady of the wallflowers with a candle in her window, and drank a bottle of ginger beer with a sacramental air. The little old lady asked him, a trifle archly, after his sister, and he promised to bring her again some day. I'll certainly bring her, he said, talking to the little old lady somehow blunted his sense of desolation. And then home through the white indistinctness in a state of melancholy that became at last so fine as to be almost pleasurable. The day after that mood, a new text attracted and perplexed Mrs. Munday, an inscription at once mysterious and familiar, and this inscription was Mizpah. It was in Old English lettering and evidently very carefully executed. Where had she seen it before? It quite dominated all the rest of the room at first. It flaunted like a flag of triumph over discipline, and the timetable and the schema. Once indeed it was taken down, but the day after it reappeared. Later, a list of scholastic vacancies partially obscured it, and some pencil memoranda were written on the margin. And when at last the time came for him to pack up and leave Wortley, he took it down and used it with several other suitable papers. The schema and the timetable were its next door neighbours, to line the bottom of the yellow box in which he packed his books, chiefly books for that matriculation that had now to be postponed. Chapter 8. The Career Prevails. There is an interval of 2 years and a half, and the story resumes with a much maturer Mr. Lewisham, indeed no longer a youth but a man, a legal man at any rate, of 21 years. Its scene is no longer little Wortley embedded among its trees, ruddy banks, parks and common land, but the grey spaciousness of West London. It does not resume with Ethel at all, for that promised second letter never reached him, and though he spent many an afternoon during his first few months in London wondering about Clapham, that arid waste of people, the meeting that he longed for, never came, until at last, after the manner of youth, so gloriously recuperative in body, heart and soul, he began to forget. The quest of a crib had ended in the unexpected fruition of Dunkerley's blue paper. The green-blue certificates had, it seemed, a value beyond mural decoration, and when Lewisham was already despairing of any employment for the rest of his life, came a marvellous blue document from the Education Department promising inconceivable things. He was to go to London and be paid a guinea a week for listening to lectures beyond his most ambitious dreams. Among the names that swam before his eyes was Huxley, and then Lockyer. What a chance to get! Is it any wonder that for 3 memorable years the career prevailed with him? You figure him on his way to the Normal School of Science at the opening of his 3rd year of study there. They call the place the Royal College of Science in these latter days. He carried in his right hand a shiny black bag, well stuffed with textbooks, notes, and apparatus for the forthcoming session, and in his left was a book that the bag had no place for, a book with gilt edges, and its binding very carefully protected by a brown paper cover. The lapse of time had asserted itself upon his upper lip in an inaggressive but indisputable moustache, in an added inch or so of stature, and in his less conscious carriage, for he no longer felt that universal attention he believed in at 18. It was beginning to dawn on him, indeed, that quite a number of people were entirely indifferent to the fact of his existence. But if less conscious, his carriage was decidedly more confident, as of one with whom the world goes well. His costume was, with one exception, a tempered black, mourning put to hard uses and cutting up rusty. The mourning was for his mother, who had died more than a year before the date when this story resumes, and had left him property that capitalized at nearly £100, a sum which Lewisham hoarded jealously in the saving bank, paying only for such essentials as university fees, and the books and instruments his brilliant career as a student demanded. For he was having a brilliant career, after all, in spite of the Wortley check, licking up paper certificates, indeed, like a devouring flame. Surveying him, madam, your eye would inevitably have fallen to his collar, curiously shiny, a surface like wet gum, although it has practically nothing to do with this story. I know, dispose of that before I go on, or you will be inattentive. London has its mysteries, but this strange gloss on his linen. Cheap laundresses always make your things blue, protests the lady. It ought to have been blue-stained, generously frayed, and loose about the button, fretting his neck. But this gloss, you would have looked nearer, and finally you would have touched a charnel house surface, dank and cool. You see, madam, the collar was a patent waterproof one of those you wash overnight with a toothbrush and hang on the back of your chair to dry, and there you have it next morning, rejuvenesced. It was the only collar he had in the world. It saved 3p a week at least, and that to a South Kensington science teacher in training, living on the guinea a week, allowed by a parental but parsimonious government, is a sum to consider. It had come to Lewisham as a great discovery. He had seen it first in a shop window full of India rubber goods, and it lay at the bottom of a glass bowl in which goldfish drifted discontentedly to and fro. And he told himself that he rather liked that gloss. But the wearing of a bright red tie would have been unexpected. A bright red tie after the fashion of a southwestern railway guard. The rest of him by no means dandiacal, even the vanity of glasses long since abandoned. You would have reflected, where you had seen a crowd, red ties abundant and in some way significant. The truth has to be told, Mr. Lewisham had become a socialist. That red tie was indeed but one outward and visible sign of much inward and spiritual development. Lewisham, in spite of the demands of a studious career, had read his butler's analogy through by this time, and some other books, he had argued, had had doubts, and called upon God for faith in the silence of the night, faith to be delivered immediately if Mr. Lewisham's patronage was valued, and which nevertheless was not so delivered. And his conception of his destiny in this world was no longer an avenue of examinations to a remote bar and political eminence in the liberal interest. He had begun to realize certain aspects of our social order that Wortley did not demonstrate, begun to feel something of the dull stress deepening to absolute wretchedness and pain, which is the colour of so much human life in modern London. One vivid contrast hung in his mind, symbolical. On the one hand were the coolies of the Westbourne Park yards, on strike and gaunt and hungry, children begging in the black slush, and starving loungers outside the soup kitchen, and on the other, Westbourne Grove, 2 streets further, a blazing array of crowded shops, a stirring traffic of cabs and carriages, and such a spate of spending that a tired student in leaky boots and graceless clothes, hurrying home, was continually impeded in the whirl of skirts and parcels and sweetly pretty womanliness. No doubt the tired student's own inglorious sensations pointed the moral, but that was only one of a perpetually reoccurring series of vivid approximations. Lewisham had a strong persuasion, an instinct, it may be, that human beings should not be happy while others near them were wretched, and this gay glitter of prosperity had touched him with a sense of crime. He still believed people were responsible for their own lives. In those days he had still to gauge the possibilities of moral stupidity in himself and his fellow men. He happened upon progress and poverty just then, and some casual numbers of the common weal, and it was only too easy to accept the theory of cunning, plotting capitalists and landowners and faultless, righteous martyr workers. He became a socialist forthwith. The necessity to do something at once to manifest the new faith that was in him was naturally urgent. So he went out and, historical moment, bought that red tie. "Blood colour, please," said Lewisham meekly to the young lady at the counter. "What colour?" said the young lady at the counter sharply. "A bright scarlet, please," said Lewisham, blushing. And he spent the best part of the evening and much of his temper in finding out how to tie this into a neat bow. It was a plunge into novel handicraft, for previously he had been accustomed to make-up ties. So it was that Lewisham proclaimed the social revolution. The first time that symbol went abroad, a string of stalwart policemen were walking in single file along the Brompton Road. In the opposite direction marched Lewisham. He began to hum. He passed the policeman with a significant eye and humming the Marseillaise. But that was months ago, and by this time the red tie was a thing of use and wont. He turned out of the Exhibition Road through a gateway of wrought iron and entered the hall of the normal school. The hall was crowded with students carrying books, bags, and boxes of instruments, students standing and chattering, students reading the framed and glazed notices of the debating society, students buying notebooks, pencils, rubber, and drawing pins from the privileged stationer. There was a strong representation of new hands, the paying students, youths and young men in black coats and silk hats or tweed suits, the scholar contingent, youngsters of Lewisham's class, raw, shabby, discordant, grotesquely ill-dressed and awe-stricken. One Lewisham noticed with a sailor's peaked cap, gold decorated, and one with mittens and very genteel grey kid gloves, and Grummet, the perennial officer of the books, was busy among them. "There's odds a list," said a wit. Lewisham pretended not to hear and blushed vividly. He often wished he did not blush quite so much, seeing he was a man of 21. He looked studiously away from the Debating Society notice board, whereon G.E. Lewisham on Socialism was announced for the next Friday, and struggled through the hall to where the book awaited his signature. Presently he was hailed by name, and then again. He could not get to the book for a minute or so because of the hand-shaking and clumsy friendly jests of his fellow men. He was pointed out to a raw hand by the raw hand's experienced fellow townsman as "that beast Lewisham, awful swat." He was second last year on the year's work, frightful mugger. But all these swats have a touch of the beastly prig. Exams, Debating Society, more exams, don't seem to have ever heard of being alive. Never goes near a music hall from one year's end to the other. Lewisham heard a shrill whistle, made a run for the lift and caught it just on the point of departure. The lift was unlit and full of black shadows. Only the sapper who conducted it was distinct. As Lewisham peered doubtfully at the dim faces near him, a girl's voice addressed him by name. "Is that you, Miss Haydinger?" he answered. "I didn't see. I hope you have had a pleasant vacation." Chapter 9. Alice Haydinger. When he arrived at the top of the building, he stood aside for the only remaining passenger to step out before him. It was the Miss Haydinger who had addressed him, the owner of that gilt-edged book in the cover of brown paper. No one else had come all the way up from the ground floor. The rest of the load in the lift had emerged at the astronomical and chemical floors, but these two had both chosen zoology for the third year of their study, and zoology lived in the attics. She stepped into the light with a rare touch of colour springing to her cheeks in spite of herself. Lewisham perceived an alteration in her dress. Perhaps she was looking for and noticed the transitory surprise in his face. The previous session, their friendship was now nearly a year old. It had never once dawned upon him that she could possibly be pretty. The chief thing he had been able to recall with any definiteness during the vacation was that her hair was not always tidy, and that even when it chanced to be so, she was nervous about it. She distrusted it. He remembered her gesture while she talked, a patting exploration that verged on the exasperating. From that, he went on to remember that its colour was, on the whole, fair, a light brown. But he had forgotten her mouth. He had failed to name the colour of her eyes. She wore glasses, it is true, and her dress was indefinite in his memory, an amorphous dinginess. And yet he had seen a good deal of her. They were not in the same course, but he had made her acquaintance on the committee of the school debating society. Lewisham was just then discovering socialism. That had afforded the basis of conversation, an incentive to intercourse. She seemed to find something rarely interesting in his peculiar view of things, and as chance would have it, he met her accidentally quite a number of times, in the corridors of the schools, in the big education library, and in the art museum. After a time, those meetings appear to have been no longer accidental. Lewisham, for the first time in his life, began to fancy he had conversational powers. She resolved to stir up his ambitions. An easy task. She thought he had exceptional gifts and that she might serve to direct them. She certainly developed his vanity. She had matriculated at the London University, and they took the intermediate examination in science together in July. She a little unwisely, which served, as almost anything will serve in such cases, as a further link between them. She failed, which in no way diminished Lewisham's regard for her. On the examination days, they discoursed about friendship in general, and things like that, down the Burlington Arcade during the lunchtime. Burlington Arcade, undisguisedly amused by her learned dinginess and his red tie, and among other things that were said, she reproached him for not reading poetry. When she parted in Piccadilly after the examination, they agreed to write about poetry and themselves during the holidays, and then she lent him, with a touch of hesitation, Rossetti's poems. He began to forget what had at first been very evident to him, that she was 2 or 3 years older than he. Lewisham spent the vacation with an unsympathetic but kindly uncle, who was a plumber and builder. His uncle had a family of 6, the eldest 11, and Lewisham made himself agreeable and instructive. Moreover, he worked hard for the culminating 3rd year of his studies, in which he had decided to do great things, and he learnt to ride the ordinary bicycle. He also thought about Miss Haydinger, and she, it would seem, thought about him. He argued on social questions with his uncle, who was a prominent local conservative. His uncle's controversial methods were coarse in the extreme. Socialists, he said, were thieves. The object of socialism was to take away what a man earned and give it to a lot of lazy scoundrels. Also, rich people were necessary. If there weren't well-off people, how'd you think I'd get a living, eh? And where'd you be then? Socialism, his uncle assured him, was got up by agitators. They get money out of young gabbies like you, and they spend it in champagne. And thereafter he met Mr. Lewisham's arguments with the word champagne uttered in an irritating voice, followed by a luscious pantomime of drinking. Naturally, Lewisham felt a little lonely, and perhaps he laid stress upon it in his letters to Miss Haydinger. It came to light that she felt rather lonely too. They discussed the question of true as distinguished from ordinary friendship, and from that they passed to Goethe and elective affinities. He told her how he looked for her letters, and they became more frequent. Her letters were indisputably well written. Had he been a journalist with a knowledge of per thou, he would have known each for a day's work. After the practical plumber had been asking what he expected to make by this here science of his, rereading her letters was balsamic. He liked Rossetti. The exquisite sense of separation in the blessed damsel touched him. But on the whole, he was a little surprised at Miss Haydinger's taste in poetry. Rossetti was so sensuous, so florid. He had scarcely expected that sort of thing. Altogether, he had returned to the schools decidedly more interested in her than when they had parted, and the curious vague memories of her appearance as something a little frayed and careless vanished at sight in her emerging from the darkness of the lift. Her hair was in order. As the light glanced through it, it looked even pretty, and she wore a well-made dark green and black dress, loose gathered as was the fashion in those days, that somehow gave a needed touch of warmth to her face. Her hat, too, was a change from the careless lumpishness of last year, a hat that, to a feminine mind, would have indicated design. It suited her. These things are past the male novelist explaining. "I have this book of yours, Miss Haydinger," he said. "I am glad you have written that paper on socialism," she replied, taking the brown-covered volume. They walked along the little passage towards the biological laboratory side by side, and she stopped at the hat pegs to remove her hat. For that was the shameless way of the place. A girl student had to take her hat off publicly, and publicly assume the holland apron that was to protect her in the laboratory, not even a looking glass. I shall come and hear your paper, she said. I hope you will like it, said Lewisham at the door of the laboratory. In the vacation I have been collecting evidence about ghosts. You remember our arguments? Though I did not tell you in my letters. I am sorry you're still obdurate, said Lewisham. I thought that was over. And have you read Looking Backward? I want to. I have it here with my other books. If you'd care for me to lend it to you, wait till I reach my table. My hands are so full. They entered the laboratory together, Lewisham holding the door open, courtly wise, Miss Haydinger taking a reassuring pat at her hair. Near the door was a group of 4 girls, which group Miss Haydinger joined, holding the brown-covered book as inconspicuously as possible. 3 of them had been through the previous 2 years with her, and they greeted her by her Christian name. They had previously exchanged glances at her appearance in Lewisham's company. A morose, elderly young demonstrator brightened momentarily at the sight of Lewisham. Well, we've got one of the decent ones anyhow, and the morose, elderly young demonstrator who was apparently taking an inventory and then brightening at a fresh entry. Ah, and here's Smithers. Chapter 10. In the Gallery of Old Iron. As one goes into South Kensington Art Museum from the Brompton Road, the Gallery of Old Iron is overhead to the right, but the way thither is exceedingly devious and not to be revealed to anybody, since the young people who pursue science and art thereabouts set a peculiar value on its seclusion. The gallery is long and narrow and dark, and set with iron gates, iron-bound chests, locks, bolts, and bars, fantastic great keys, lamps, and the like, and over the balustrade one may lean and talk of one's finer feelings and regard Michelangelo's horned Moses or Trajan's column in plaster rising gigantic out of the hall below and far above the level of the gallery. And here, on a Wednesday afternoon, were Lewisham and Miss Haydinger, the Wednesday afternoon immediately following that paper on socialism that you saw announced on the notice board in the hall. The paper had been an immense success, closely reasoned, delivered with a disciplined emotion, the redoubtable Smithers practically converted, the reply after the debate methodical and complete, and it may be there were symptoms of that febrile affection known to the vulgar as swelled. Lewisham regarded Moses and spoke of his future. Miss Haydinger, for the most part, watched his face. And then, says Miss Haydinger, one must bring these views prominently before people. I believe still in pamphlets. I have thought. Lewisham paused. It is to be hoped through modesty. Yes, said Miss Haydinger. Well, Luther, you know, there is room, I think, in socialism for a Luther. Yes, said Miss Haydinger, imagining it. Yes, that would be a grand way. So it seemed to many people in those days. But eminent reformers have been now for more than 7 years going about the walls of the social Jericho, blowing their own trumpets and shouting, with such small result beyond incidental displays of ill temper within, that it is hard to recover the fine hopefulness of those departed days. Yes, said Miss Haydinger, that would be a grand way. Lewisham appreciated the quality of personal emotion in her voice. He turned his face towards her and saw unstinted admiration in her eyes. It would be a great thing to do, he said, and added, quite modestly, if only one could do it. You could do it. You think I could? Lewisham blushed vividly with pleasure. I do. Certainly you could set out to do it. Even to fail hopelessly would be great. Sometimes, she hesitated. He looked in expectation. I think sometimes it is greater even to fail than to succeed. I don't see that, said the proposed Luther, and his eyes went back to the Moses. She was about to speak and changed her mind. Contemplative pause. And then, when a great number of people have heard of your views, she said presently, then I suppose we must form a party and bring things about. Another pause, full, no doubt, of elevated thoughts. I say, said Lewisham quite suddenly, you do put, courage into a chap. I shouldn't have done that socialism paper if it hadn't been for you. He turned round and stood, leaning with his back to the Moses, and smiling at her. You do help a fellow, he said. That was one of the vivid moments of Miss Heydinger's life. She changed colour a little. Do I? She said, standing straight and awkward and looking into his face. I'm glad. I haven't thanked you for your letters, said Lewisham, and I've been thinking, yes? We're first-rate friends, aren't we? The best friends. She held out her hand and drew a breath. Yes, she said as they gripped. He hesitated whether to hold her hand. He looked into her eyes, and at that moment she would have given 3/4 of the years she had still to live to have had eyes and features that could have expressed her. Instead, she felt her face hard, the little muscles of her mouth twitching insubordinate, and fancied that her self-consciousness made her eyes dishonest. What I mean, said Lewisham, is that this will go on. We're always going to be friends, side by side. Always. Just as I am able to help you, I will help you. However I can help you, I will. We two, said Lewisham, gripping her hand. Her face lit. Her eyes were for a moment touched with the beauty of simple emotion. We two, she said, and her lips trembled and her throat seemed to swell. She snatched her hand back suddenly and turned her face away. Abruptly she walked towards the end of the gallery, and he saw her fumbling for her handkerchief in the folds of the green and black dress. She was going to cry. It set Lewisham marvelling, this totally inappropriate emotion. He followed her and stood by her. Why cry? He hoped no one would come into the little gallery until her handkerchief was put away. Nevertheless, he felt vaguely flattered. She controlled herself, dashed her tears away, and smiled bravely at him with reddened eyes. I'm sorry, she said, gulping. I'm so glad, she explained. But we will fight together. We two, I can help you. I know I can help you. And there is such work to be done in the world. You are very good to help me, said Lewisham, quoting a phrase from what he had intended to say before he found out that he had a hold upon her emotions. No. Has it ever occurred to you, she said abruptly, how little a woman can do alone in the world? Or a man, he answered, after a momentary meditation. So it was Lewisham enrolled his first ally in the cause of the red tie, and the greatness that was presently to come. His first ally, for hitherto, save for the indiscretion of his mural inscriptions, he had made the secret of his private ambitions. In that now half-forgotten love affair at Wortley, even he had, in spite of the considerable degree of intimacy attained, said absolutely nothing about his career. Chapter 11. Manifestations. Miss Heydinger declined to disbelieve in the spirits of the dead, and this led to controversy in the laboratory over tea. For the girl students, being in the majority that year, had organised tea between 4 o'clock and the advent of the extinguishing policeman at 5. And the men students were occasionally invited to tea, but not more than 2 of them at a time really participated, because there were only 2 spare cups after that confounded Simmons broke the third. Smithers, the square-headed student with the hard grey eyes, argued against the spirits of the dead with positive animosity, while Bletherley, who displayed an orange tie and lank hair in unshorn abundance, was vaguely open-minded. What is love? Asked Bletherley. Surely that, at any rate, is immortal. His remark was considered irrelevant and ignored. Lewisham, as became the most prominent student of the year, weighed the evidence comprehensively under headings. He dismissed the mediumistic seances as trickery. Rot and imposture, said Smithers loudly, and with an oblique glance to see if his challenge reached its mark. Its mark was a grizzled little old man with a very small face and very big grey eyes, who had been standing listlessly at one of the laboratory windows until the discussion caught him. He wore a brown velvet jacket and was reputed to be enormously rich. His name was Lagoon. He was not a regular attendant, but one of those casual outsiders who are admitted to laboratories that are not completely full. He was known to be an ardent spiritualist. It was even said that he had challenged Huxley to a public discussion on materialism, and he came to the biological lectures and worked intermittently in order, he explained, to fight disbelief with its own weapons. He rose greedily to Smithers' controversial Bates. I say no, he said, calling down the narrow laboratory and following his voice. He spoke with the ghost of a lisp. Pardon my interrupting, sir. The question interests me profoundly. I hope I don't intrude. Excuse me, sir. Make it personal. Am I a fool or an impostor? Well, parried Smithers, with all a South Kensington student's want of polish, that's a bit personal. Assume, sir, that I am an honest observer. Well, I have seen spirits, heard spirits, felt the touch of spirits. He opened his pale eyes very widely. Fool, then, said Smithers in an undertone which did not reach the ears of the spiritualist. You may have been deceived, paraphrased Lewisham. I can assure you others can see, hear, feel. I have tested, sir. Tested. I have some scientific training and I have employed tests. Scientific and exhaustive tests, every possible way. I ask you, sir, have you given the spirits a chance? It is only paying guineas to humbugs, said Smithers. There you are, prejudice. Here is a man, denies the facts and consequently won't see them, won't go near them. But you wouldn't have every man in the three kingdoms who disbelieved in spirits attend seances before he should be allowed to deny? Most assuredly, yes. Most assuredly, yes. He knows nothing about it till then. The argument became heated. The little old gentleman was soon under way. He knew a person of the most extraordinary gifts, a medium. Paid? Asked Smithers. Would you muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn? Said Lagoon promptly. Smithers' derision was manifest. Would you distrust the balance because you brought it? Come and see. Lagoon was now very excited and inclined to gesticulate and raise his voice. He invited the whole class incontinently to a series of special seances. Not all at once, the spirits, new influences, but in sections. I warn you, we may get nothing, but the chances are I would rejoice infinitely. So it came about that Lewisham consented to witness a spirit raising. Miss Haydinger, it was arranged, should be there, and the skeptic, Smithers, Lagoon, his typewriter, and the medium would complete the party. Afterwards, there was to be another party for the others. Lewisham was glad he had the moral support of Smithers. It's an evening wasted, said Smithers, who had gallantly resolved to make the running for Lewisham in the contest of the Forbes medal. But I'll prove my case. You see if I don't. They were given an address in Chelsea. The house, when Lewisham found it at last, proved a large one, with such an air of mellow dignity that he was abashed. He hung his hat up for himself beside a green-trimmed hat of straw in the wide, rich-toned hall. Through an open door he had a glimpse of a palatial study, bookshelves bearing white busts, a huge writing table lit by a green-shaded electric lamp and covered thickly with papers. The housemaid looked, he thought, with infinite disdain at the rusty mourning and flamboyant tie, and flounced about and led him upstairs. She rapped, and there was a discussion within. They're at it already, I believe, she said to Lewisham confidentially. Mr. Lagoon's always at it. There were sounds of chairs being moved, Smithers' extensive voice making a suggestion, and laughing nervously. Lagoon appeared opening the door. His grizzled face seemed smaller, and his big grey eyes larger than usual. "We are just going to begin without you," he whispered. "Come along." The room was furnished even more finely than the drawing room of the Wortley Grammar School, hitherto the finest room, except certain of the state apartments at Windsor, known to Lewisham. The furniture struck him in a general way as akin to that of the South Kensington Museum. His first impression was an appreciation of the vast social superiority of the chairs. It seemed impertinent to think of sitting on anything quite so quietly stately. He perceived Smithers standing with an air of bashful hostility against the bookcase. Then he was aware that Lagoon was asking them all to sit down. Already seated at the table was the medium, Chaffery, a benevolent-looking, faintly shabby gentleman with bushy iron-grey side whiskers, a wide, thin-lipped mouth tucked in at the corners, and the chin like the toe of a boot. He regarded Lewisham critically and disconcertingly over gilt glasses. Miss Haydinger was quite at her ease and began talking at once. Lewisham's replies were less confident than they had been in the gallery of the Old Iron. Indeed, there was almost a reversal of their positions. She led, and he was abashed. He felt obscurely that she had taken advantage of him. He became aware of another girlish figure in a dark dress on the right. Everyone moved towards the round table in the centre of the room, on which lay a tambourine and a little green box. Lagoon developed unsuspected lengths of knobby wrist and finger directing his guests to their seats. Lewisham was to sit next to him, between him and the medium. Beyond the medium sat Smithers, with Miss Haydinger on the other side of him, linked to Lagoon by the typewriter. So skeptics compassed the medium about. The company was already seated before Lewisham looked across Lagoon and met the eyes of the girl next to that gentleman. It was Ethel. The close green dress, the absence of a hat, and a certain loss of colour made her seem less familiar, but did not prevent that instant recognition. And there was recognition in her eyes. Immediately she looked away. At first his only emotion was surprise. He would have spoken, but a little thing robbed him of speech. For a moment he was unable to remember her surname. Moreover, the strangeness of his surroundings made him undecided. He did not know what was the proper way to address her, and he still kept to the superstition of etiquette. Besides, to speak to her would involve a general explanation to all these people. "Just leave a pinpoint of gas, Mr. Smithers, please," said Lagoon, and suddenly the one surviving jet of the gas chandelier was turned down, and they were in darkness. The moment for recognition had passed. The joining of hands was punctiliously verified. The circle was linked little finger to little finger. Lewisham's abstraction received a rebuke from Smithers. The medium, speaking in an affable voice, premised that he could promise nothing. He had no directing power over manifestations. Thereafter ensued a silence. For a space, Lewisham was inattentive to all that happened. He sat in the breathing darkness, staring at the dim, elusive shape that had presented that remembered face. His mind was astonishment mingled with annoyance. He had settled that this girl was lost to him forever. The spell of the old days of longing, of the afternoons that he had spent after his arrival in London, wandering through Clapham with a fading hope of meeting her, had not returned to him. But he was ashamed of his stupid silence and irritated by the awkwardness of the situation. At once he was on the very verge of breaking the compact and saying, "Miss Henderson," across the table. How was it he had forgotten that Henderson? He was still young enough to be surprised at forgetfulness. Smithers coughed, one might imagine with a warning intention. Lewisham, recalling his detective responsibility with an effort, peered about him, but the room was very dark. The silence was broken ever and again by deep sighs and a restless stirring from the medium. Out of this mental confusion, Lewisham's personal vanity was first to emerge. What did she think of him? Was she peering at him through the darkness even as he peered at her? Should he pretend to see her for the first time when the lights were restored? As the minutes lengthened, it seemed as though the silence grew deeper and deeper. There was no fire in the room, and it looked, for the lack of that glow, chilly. A curious skepticism arose in his mind as to whether he had actually seen Ethel or only mistaken someone else for her. He wanted the seance over in order that he might look at her again. The old days at Wortley came out of his memory with astonishing detail, and yet astonishingly free from emotion. He became aware of a peculiar sensation down his back that he tried to account for as a draught. Suddenly, a beam of cold air came like a touch against his face and made him shudder convulsively. Then he hoped that he had not marked his shudder. He thought of laughing a low laugh to show he was not afraid. Someone else shuddered too, and he perceived an extraordinarily vivid odour of violets. Lagoon's finger communicated a nervous quivering. What was happening? The musical box somewhere on the table began playing a rather trivial, rather plaintive air that was strange to him. It seemed to deepen the silence about him. An accent on the expectant stillness, a thread of tinkling melody spanning an abyss. Lewisham took himself in hand at this stage. What was happening? He must attend.